Welcome. Welcome to another of Carleton's philanthropy and nonprofit leadership program, PhilanthroThink's. This time, we're looking at trends and financing of Canadian charities with a focus on the tipping point. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, and we recognize the many Indigenous peoples and nations in your locales as well. As settlers, immigrants, and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and hope for a more just and equitable future together. This PhilanthroThink's a little bit different from what we usually do, is there's just the two of us, and we're going to have a conversation about data and the implications of those data for the sector. I'm Susan Phillips, professor in the program, Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Paloma Raggo, who is Associate Professor of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership here at Carleton University School of Public Policy and Administration. Paloma is the Director and Principal Investigator of the Charity Insights Canada project that she'll tell you more about. Her research focuses on nonprofit leadership and governance, global philanthropy, and research methods. Dr. Raggo holds a degree from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University and has extensive practitioner experience in advocacy and lobbying prior to rejoining academe. Always good to see you, Paloma.
Thanks, Susan.
And note that we are recording, and if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll have them curated and get to as many of them as possible. Paloma, before we start with the data and the substance, could you tell us more about the Charity Insights project, how it came to be, what it does, because it's unique. It's unique in Canada and undoubtedly the world, as we hear.
Thanks, Susan. So I will share my screen. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I think it's a really interesting moment in Canada and around the world to be having these discussions. So I'll try to be brief, and those who know me well know that it's not my strong suit. So Susan, always feel free to tell me to move along. But the impetus for the Charity Insights Canada project came really from a question we were asked and a desire on the ground. A lot of people have this perception that we have a data deficit in Canada. Data deficit meaning what do we know about the sector, what data is out there. And in some aspects, that's very true. But in many others, what we have is almost this data paradox. We have a lot of information, but the information is either disaggregated, fragmented, and it's hard for us to really have information up to date on the moment when problems occur. And that, is due to many things. Us academics taking a lot of time to publish our results, but also the challenges of asking extremely busy people doing extremely important work to keep giving us their time. And so how can we give back the information that we collect? Ultimately, this data is not ours. It's the practitioners, it's the sectors. So how can we reduce this timing? And so the question was that we were asked, and the answer we offered through the CICP was, how can we have real-time data on the nonprofit sector and make sure that this data reflects the current trend, not the trends 2 years after? And the practitioners who are in the audience, I'm sure, are very painfully aware of this, saying, okay, this is not the problem today, this was the problem yesterday. So part of our answer was to propose a really rapid response survey model. So traditionally, people are asked they receive an email saying, do you have 15 minutes of your time to answer? And people are like, I just don't. So we decided, rather than doing one time long shot survey, spend time, analyzing, which is really important, we decided to change the model and take our long survey and do like this. So we recruited people and asked them to commit charities across the country through the CRA. And during the question, I can go on the technicalities of our recruitment process. But the idea is very simple. On Wednesday, we ask people working in registered charities across the country, so we have about 1,000 in our panel, to answer surveys that are less than 2 minutes. So on Wednesday, we send the survey. On Thursday, we remind some people that forgot to answer the survey. On Friday, we publish the results. So every week, we send surveys out on the latest trends, questions. We ask about many things. So today I'll present some data points, but I really invite you to go on the website, engage on our LinkedIn, because we try to push out a lot of information. But every week we publish on funding, governance, from board, from how you recruit people, hiring practices. So a lot of themes. And the beauty of our model is that each week the themes are different, but at the end of the year, because it's the same people in the same organizations that have answered throughout the year, we get a really complete picture of organizations over the year. So that's the idea behind, the CICP. I can go on more details, but the idea is this data component. The CICP is not just the surveys. So that's a big part of our work. But the other part is preparing briefs, sharing the information, like this tipping point that we published several reports. And the idea here is to get the information as quickly as we can, curate it, analyze it, so that practitioners, funders, people in the sector, policymakers can use those data to make data-driven decisions and considerations. So that's the second part. And the third part, we have an aspect called the Community Education Center, where we build on data, because key to data, and I believe that, and I know Susan and I have had lots of discussion about this, is without data literacy, understanding really what data can do, what it is, and how to use it, all this knowledge won't yield as much change and transformation as we need. So part of our mission is to develop short educational capsule to just kind of build the foundations. It's not to replace, courses, and I have the joy, some of my students will disagree with that, but I have the joy of teaching research methods. But this is really to build the founding blocks, really, of our understanding. I don't know if you wanted more details, Susan, or...
No, that's great, and we are so thankful to the funders who saw the need, who saw the radical vision, and it was a radical vision when you first proposed it, Paloma. And a lot of that information is also on the websites. So tell us more about the tipping point, the recent study.
So what was interesting is, I think when we decided, okay, what's the format or the deliverable that we could share that would highlight what we're seeing, the trends, and what emerged from our discussion. And, it's important for me to acknowledge that this is really a team effort. We have people working, and I'm thinking of Kim and Nguyen, Tara McWinney, Callie Matheson, Bridget, here on our team, and two who look at all the information, and as a team, we're like discussing, okay, what are we noticing? And what we noticed, in particular this year, is this idea of triple squeeze. That's how we framed it initially. And then I was like, squeeze. And we talked about a trilemma. And the idea behind the trilemma is that there are always competing stressors on the sector. There has always been. It seems like we hear crisis after crisis. But what's happening right now is that we have three important stressors coming together at this moment of time. The first one is regarding funding uncertainty and funding needs not being met, but not just being met now, but consistently. And that consistently, and we praise practitioner a lot. We've discussed this in our team about their resiliency. It's great, we frame it in a positive way, but resiliency implies that at some point you get a break. You have time to recover, to build sustainability. And that moment, at least maybe some people in the audience will know when that happened and I missed it, but this is not happening. And adding to this funding precarity, we add another capacity that is increasingly unable to meet the demand. Demands for services, demands for support are increasing. And this is in a background of a greater macroeconomic atmosphere where historically a lot of the functions from the government had been devolved to the sector, and now we're in this moment where governments are like, but you're supposed to be doing this. And the sector is keep saying, but I don't have the support, the funding, the needs, the recognition. And so this rising demands, coupled with a rising of operational costs, really is adding to this funding precarity that we have. So that's the second. And the third, and that's why it's a trilemma, because the third stressor really relates around people. It's hard to not only recruit, train, and find the qualified people, but there. The main problem is retaining them, working in a sector that is underfunded, stressed, where a lot of uncompensated work happens. And we have seen that in some of our surveys where let's make a difference here between employees volunteering their time, because we're not talking about volunteering here, although there's a stressor aspect of the challenges of retaining volunteers. We're talking about the workforce. It's time to look deeply into the sector's workforce. Mental health issues, retention issues, benefits, and compensations are key. So these three coming raise the question, are we in a moment where resiliency is not possible anymore? From a structural point of view. And so that's really where our reflection and the latest briefing note that we shared highlights throughout our surveys. These are the trends that we're seeing.
Paloma, these aren't entirely new trends at all. I've worked in this around this sector for a long time, and I remember back to the early 2000s, like 2005. Catherine Scott did the report on Funding Matters, and there were other reports and other talks at the time that said there's that squeeze of finances, rising demand. What's different this time? Is you make it sound like, while this may have a long-standing tail or long-standing roots, that somehow we're in a new and perhaps more serious situation. How would you characterize that?
I think it's a really good question, and I will offer what I think is happening, and then I'm really open to hearing and learning from the audience on this. I think a couple of things. Right after COVID, in which, this was such a transformational crisis for the sector, we feared a lot of things that didn't necessarily materialize. A lot of people at the time predicted there are going to be mass layoffs, all these problems. And what happened is that there was a really robust intervention with help But now what we're seeing is the end of this little period where organizations could kind of surf the hump without any replacement, without any solutions. So the problems and the stressors that develop during these periods have just been pushed back to now. That's one. The second one I see, the second is really more global, and the impact of economic uncertainty and political uncertainty, and the impact of the current situation in the US, but also in Europe, has a greater impact that we can necessarily feel right now, because this impact impacts in the way the sector's framed, the work is framed, and our policies and the response from government are enacted and framed. So I think in all that, it's a good moment for Canada as a country, as a sector, the Canadian sector, to really think and think about what's next collectively for our sector. Are we leaning into our identity, our important part of the system we have in Canada of meeting Canadians need, whether it's in terms of services, but even beyond that, of, raising awareness and all these things that charities and nonprofits in general do? Or are we leaning towards more a different type of model, or a more Americanized model? And we can see some initial whispers on the ground. In the next year is going to be critical for us as a project to collect data on this. Some people have reported initial cuts, almost preemptive compliance from the policy side, and saying, yeah, we are not going to fund this program anymore, so be prepared. And so organizations are starting to adopt certain strategy. So, our role here is more to convey, to share data of what we're seeing, and hopefully that equips organizations that have to make a case based on data with what we see. So these are the kind of main stressor that I see that are particularly different, because each time there's a crisis, we always have, I feel like Susan and I over a decade always had these discussion. This is the big one, this is the big crisis. But what's different here is really these stressors are coming together, and the recovery from COVID, we kind of almost forgot, but it was still there, was masked by some initial support, but that support now is not there. So I think it's a challenging situation, and if it's not addressed or at least discussed seriously, it's going to lead to a lot of problem down the road. And we're seeing some of it right now in the US, for example, closing some charities and lots of difficulties.
Do the data suggest that some subsectors would be affected more than others? We certainly saw that immediately as a result of COVID, where those that depended on public events, people coming together, were impacted. But this is a different scenario. Do you see it playing out more critically in some areas than others?
So what's interesting is, and I'll present some data that we used in order to craft this latest policy brief, is trends are fairly consistent across sector, which is worrying in one way, because sectors are very different. They have different needs. They operate in different ways, yet they're all feeling the same effects. But we're seeing this much more affecting much more very small organizations and larger organizations. The middle's kind of always in between, never in a great position, but not as dire as the really small ones or the larger ones that face, staff cuts and all these others. One particular area that's really affected are areas that have more intangible products. We're talking about arts organizations. We're talking about organizations that are not necessarily linked to a direct service delivery. And that, we can discuss some of the reasons why, and it might be linked to the challenges of reporting impact, of, satisfying all these demands. But the message here is that these are really across the board, but particularly for a very small organization. And when I say very small organizations, I talk about organizations with less than 100,000 of budget size. So, and average expenses over time, because they are much more vulnerable to funding fluctuations. And it goes back to our trilemma. If organizations are not able to plan expenses, staff, contracts, programs beyond their fiscal year, it's really hard to sustain a strategic plan for growth and sustainability. So you're always in the adaptability, resiliency phase. But what we would like to push people is towards sustainability, meaning that it works. And then we can think of what needs to be changed and not stay in the emergency phase. So just to give you a quick idea, for example, one of the surveys we asked about was related to grant writing, because let's be real here. A lot of organizations spend so much time trying to get funding, and what we saw was that on average, for one single grant, organization, about a third of organization will spend at least 16 or more hours, but that doesn't necessarily play out in their success rate. And I'll show that later. And what we find in the data is that organizations that write a lot of grant and are larger, so that have the capacity or the staff, presumably, to write these grants, are way more successful. So it's really, they understood the assignment, the system, they have their method down. Small organizations that really need the support and really need the funding are way less successful. So that tells us about the kind of support that is needed, because it's a lot of time that is not always wasted, because, we're academics, we spend our life writing grants, but it's not optimized. The time is not optimized, and the cost of seeking funding all the time is often not acknowledged, because they get funding for programs, not necessarily for the staff that they need to write these grants. And so when we asked organizations, what was interesting is we asked them to predict, you know, on average, how successful they were. And most of the people are really in the range where they're not that successful. Very few, so the 20 to 25% of our respondents estimate that on average they're successful about 20% of the time, 18% of the time. So there's no clear winner that, all the time. And when we ask them who writes the grant, most of them is, it's like a kitchen, and you have someone that does everything from plating, serving, and doing everything. So you don't have the efficiencies created when you have support specifically on this really important aspect. And so most organizations do not have someone whose job, whose specialty, whose skills are dedicated to write grants.
Is there a lesson in that, implications for government as granting agencies, for foundations, and for the sector as a whole, how it might help itself be more effective in the grant writing, grant seeking process?
I think there are so many. There are so many, and I'm sure our audience will have so many reaction to these particular numbers. But one really quick that comes to mind is in terms of what's required to submit. So the amounts, so sometimes they vary so wildly in terms of what they need. So some kind of coordination, even within government or between funders, of what's required. Myself, just the process of gathering all the papers, all the letters, all the things is such an amount of time. Then, in terms of feedback, if you ask people to submit something, provide them an opportunity to learn why. And there is a real gap because it's a capacity gap. But from the government side, please invest in either having meetings, capacity building in that sense. And that's something that can be implemented and supported because obviously there's a learning missing here. If you keep applying and you're missing the mark, how can you improve if you throw these applications down in the void? And then you know recognition in the programs that you propose that this costs something to organizations to apply. So it's either supporting financially the grant writing process, as some funders do, more systematically, rather than assuming that it costs nothing to organization to apply to your grant. And that is really something funders on their side could implement. If you qualify to apply for this opportunity, then we'll support the time it takes you. But these are, I don't know, I'm sure some are doing it. Some might say, oh no, that's a bold idea, but if we don't try, we don't see if it works.
What else did the data tell us? It's so important to actually have real-time data so we know what's unfolding in the sector.
Yeah, so regarding the funding part, and I have so much, and I know our time is limited, so any questions we have, I have more data on it. But when we ask them, how has the granting scene really changed for you? A lot of say about the same, but a sizable chunk noticed it's becoming harder and harder, and we're noticing more competition, fewer funds, more concentration. We had recently, and I think you and I, Susan, talked about this. The recent Statistics Canada data on, like the donations, and oh, it's great, but what's playing out and what I suspect we're seeing is also greater concentration. So the ones that are effective at, attracting these donations are attracting more and more, and those who are not, less and less. And so we're going to see really almost this growing separation between those who can and have and those who can't access. Other things we've asked, particularly related to funding, was related to how do you spend the money you have? And what we see is nearly half their spending is really concentrated on around staff, operational costs, and a lot of their challenges, which goes back to the trilemma of the people, is supporting, you want the people that are working, that are dedicated, because you have to be dedicated to work in this sector, compensated properly. And we have a couple of surveys around that, and we're seeing more and more people doing uncompensated labor. So what it means is organizations don't have the funds to pay extra time, but the work needs to be done. So staff still do it, but for how long? And is it fair that we're relying on this willingness to just continuing doing free work? When we ask them what kind of support is needed, it's clear, consistent across years, because now we're in year 3 of our study. Core funding is needed. Funders really need to get funders, largely governments, foundations, program, whatever, need to understand core funding is needed because our costs are going up, inflation, cost of living, and everything. And it's not just for the staff, it's for organizations. Rents are more expensive. And now with the loom of potential tariffs, economic disruption, we're you have to think of the small things, paper, printing, subscriptions to Zoom and all these things, prices go up. And then at some point you have to make really difficult decisions. And the decisions are often impacted on the staff.
Could you clarify what we mean by core funding here? Because I think sometimes it's used in different ways. How was that question understood, do you think? And what is meant by core funding in this regard?
I think core funding in this regard was really meant to the funding it takes to keep the lights on and people paid. Bottom line. And so we're not talking about delivering a program, making sure that some people get the services they have. We're talking about basic structural funding because the sector in general, it's really true in the US and Canada. There's some remnant of this image that we should be only spending 20%, 80% on our programs. And this has really harmed, I think, the sector in a way that it is not true that it costs only that to do all we do. And funders need to just acknowledge this reality. Yes, there can be efficiencies, and I think that's where you and I, as educator, as scholar, can help point out places, governance, management, leadership, strategic wise. But from a donor funder perspective, we have to also accept reality that things cost what they cost. And so let's kind of push back and saying, okay, we produce this, and it's great that we make effort in evaluating, in demonstrating impact, but we cannot lose sight of the cost. We cannot assume costs are zero to produce those. And so how can we balance that? And I think that's the idea of how people react to core funding. I think people in general are clear behind core funding versus programmatic funding. And you and I have worked on an advocacy piece, and people who raise awareness, where do you put it? If it's part of your mission, it might be part of the core funding you need in order to continue your activities. And there's no clear-cut solution. This line of the budget should be there, but in general, it's really, what does it take to keep your lights on, and what's the basic minimum you have? And charities don't have that basic minimum, so they're cutting elsewhere.
Given that government, the newly elected Liberal government, we also heard it from the Conservatives during the election, is that we're going into a period of austerity. The government spends too much, needs to repurpose funding in various ways. What are the implications of that? And do you think, this is a question from one of the audience, does that create a push, an incentive, or a requirement almost for more shared services, for mergers, consolidation of those particularly smaller organizations or similar organizations working together in more than a collaborative way, in really trying to reduce some of the core costs through consolidation, through sharing? Do you see that? Do you have any evidence on that?
So we asked questions around collaboration, mergers, and a lot of organizations claim to collaborate with different other organizations, or organization particularly in their sector of activities. But in the comment, and that's what's interesting if you go on our website and download the reports, because what we report is the raw data, so you can actually read the comments that people put in. And what we find is that there's also this increased perception of, somehow I'll be penalized if I collaborate, because the assumption will be I don't need all the money because I'm collaborating with someone. So there's almost a disincentive, and we should change the model and saying there's an incentive for you to collaborate, share resources. You'll have access to more, not less. And I think it's changing this approach from the incentive really of saying, okay, you'll get rewarded if you're collaborating, if you see that there are efficiencies to be had in pooling resources. And I think the danger right now is that this might be held against charities, and so as a way to find place to cut. And let's be clear here, the the austerity, we've lived through the 90s austerities and then 2008 austerities. So the governments in general have had this policy of devolving a lot of the activities initially we thought were responsible for to the sector. And right now, they almost are in the position where they want to decide how it's done, but they don't want to do it themselves. And so the sector's kind of stuck here because they're delivering essential services that traditionally, historically, were delivered by a welfare state in many cases. And now we're seeing a change of the fundamental function. So I think governments, if they're really in this quest of austerity, need to look inwards, not necessarily at outside the government, in the sector and others, because our sector represents an important part of the economy. Yet, it doesn't receive the resources and the support needed for that. So,
And certainly we're hearing is it was very clear in the Liberal platform that efficiency and effectiveness, partnering, investing as needed, but investing in a way that saves in the long run, that leads to better results. And we will see where that goes. So what else can you tell us about the trilemma?
so there's so much I can tell you, but one of the things we've asked recently, and the April surveys are really interesting if ever anyone has the time to go on the website and download them. Because, being in the midst of an election, we also asked all these different questions, but asking them, and it's a hard question because a lot of people said, "Oh, why don't you ask about the impact of tariffs?" And I think people are unclear what the impacts are just yet, as they're, you know, changing one day, the other day is something different. But what they're saying or what people are anticipating are really funders being more and donors in general being more conservative, in the sense giving a bit less, the costs going up in operational costs like housing, rent increases and all these things, and salary expenses to meet the cost of life demand. Um, in general, when we asked about, thinking back to the last year, have costs actually increased? And so we see across the board that the two prior year were really increasing. This year, because we asked mid-year, it seems like on par almost with those who see no change. So it's, I cannot tell you, oh, this year the trend, or maybe are just getting used to higher prices, but the sticker shock was really there, the first 2023, and when we asked the question again in 2024. And lastly, just to say some things about the people and volunteer side of things in the sector. During COVID, we saw, because, in-person events were much more challenging to have, and retaining some volunteers, we kind of saw a cohort of volunteer disengagement really sharp. And now our organizations, charity in general, are rethinking what volunteers do, the engagement models and everything, because we're also experiencing in the background. I talked a lot about the economy here, but there's a background of demographic shifts happening, donor-wise, volunteer-wise as well. Um, and so what we're seeing is that in the past year, so 24, really during 2024, volunteers have remained relatively stable, and there are some grounds being moved back. And I think it's just that charities are finding new ways or adapting new ways of finding the engagement. But some of the challenge really is to the management, linked to the management of these volunteers. And that again, I feel like a broken record at this point. It goes back to the capacity, core funding, operational cost, because it is not zero. Like, yes, people in the sector are always grateful and read that our volunteers are really supporting the sector, but it's again, we assume zero cost of handling these volunteers, and the more people, and these are people, they're not necessarily just, you shouldn't consider them just as assets. And so it takes time. You cannot just schedule them. It's not staff, it's volunteer people who give their time to you. So again, recognition of these costs of these challenges are key, and these are some of the things we find.
And we know from past experience that in tough times, it's often the manager or volunteers that are the first to go, that are seen as most expendable with the consequences down the road.
Exactly.
Do you have any evidence? You mentioned demographic shift. Any evidence in how demographics are affecting volunteering as playing out through the panel of charities?
So we have some data on top of my mind. I don't have all the numbers, but what we're seeing is um, a volunteer force that is getting increasingly older, and it's the middle really that I seem doom and gloom, and I promise you I'm not, but it seems that there are a lot of growth and potential in the younger. Maybe it's because we have systems in schools and like more willingness to be engaged, but the middle, and I'm part of that middle. I think I like to think part of that middle is where there's less engagement, and this is where we have to rethink, and I say business model, but our operational model that has relied historically so much on volunteer, is that if the capacity is not there and we cannot find it, then how can we sustain it? How can we move beyond the phase of resiliency into sustainability? And it's finding solutions for that middle part. So the demographic shift in terms of volunteer, I don't think that's the number one urgency. I think it's urgent to think about it. But I think there's going to be, in a few years, the next cohort in 10 years, are really going to start seeing the problem of people being disengaged, because we're talking about the middle of younger or mid-range families, professionals. And if they don't develop this civic habit almost of really engagement, then we're going to see the volunteer cliff happening uh, in a generation, short generation.
The CICP's collected a lot of data about the workforce, the paid workforce, and the kind of skills, job position shortages, uh, other factors like mental health. Can you tell us a bit more about the labor force data?
Yeah, I can. I have one of our postdoc, Tara, is really a specialist in this area, and we're working on several projects. One of the things that we're studying, and that's really interesting, is the workforce in the charitable sector is no secret to anyone. We see it in our own Masters of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, is a highly feminized, gendered workforce. And what we're seeing is that, and we're not clear of the answer, but it seems like it's almost given that it's a highly feminized workforce, gendered workforce, there is no clear push in bettering conditions on average, because historically as well, it hasn't raised to the importance of meaningful, crucial, critical work. We see this recognized through the investment, and I'm sorry now, I feel very strongly about this, but we see this by the, some lack of investment in reporting the impact of our sector on the economy, and creating coherent data strategies, coherent infrastructure, which my hope is that the CICP contributes in really creating this visual data informed, need. But the lack of acknowledgement of this gendered workforce, and letting such difficult, because let's be real here, and on average there are very difficult working conditions with benefits being low. Let's talk just about parental leave, maternity leave, that affect disproportionately the sector, given that it's gendered and feminized. On average, organizations don't have the capacity to provide any kind of top up to the basic uh, funding that's provided, thankfully by the government. But that's a real gap if you consider that our sector is relying on so much of the, this gendered workforce. So why isn't this addressed? And flexibility in terms of working arrangement from an organizational point of view. There's always these kind of pushbacks. Working, if some organizations, and we've had some discussions with some organizations that tried this, but you implement a 4-day work week, but then your funders, donors sometimes are uncomfortable with this idea and saying, wait, you're only working 4 days, but you know this perception of that's not enough, you should be working more, you should be more in crisis. So we have lots of data that shows the challenge of providing really basic benefits, health insurance beyond, like therapeutic insurance and these things. And that is problematic because it's such a disincentive, especially for new recent graduate, to go in the sector, invest their careers in the sector, and we need that. But we need to have support for that.
It's always a challenge to talk about the labor force of the sector because in many ways it's bifurcated. You've got those who are frontline workers, again, uh, overwhelmingly female, often overwhelmingly racialized in the care economy, underpaid, all of that we hear about. But you also have um, a good chunk of leadership positions, of more senior roles. And we know from the kind of students who come into the MPNL that these are really creative, imaginative, innovative people who want to make social change, who want to do good in the world. We also know from other data studies that ONN have done that the sector isn't very good at building its pipeline into some of those leadership positions of training, of professional development, of nurturing, of building along. Do you have any evidence from the CICP about that part of the workforce, about ability to retain, opportunities to train, to move forward into organizational leadership?
It's interesting because our other postdoc, Kim, works a lot on the learning and the skills needed in the sector. We have some, maybe I shouldn't say that because I, don't want to bias her, but we'll have some more questions around leadership and leadership transition. One of the things we have found was that organizations are very keen in finding training opportunities, but they're also limited by their ability to pay for those opportunities. So they do a lot of in-house training, skill building, which is great because, some is better than none. But in that's it's a conversation I had with Kim. It also has an important caveat here is that we need to facilitate knowledge sharing, whether it's through collaborations with other academic institutions, initiatives, learning initiatives, because there is something to be said about renewing our best practices and keeping training opportunities in-house all the time can lead you to develop certain blinders, if you want, and views that are not necessarily reflective of what's happening elsewhere. So, you know, more engagement opportunity, discussions like we're having today, access to almost outside learning opportunities, I think are key here. The access part, the time part, the capacity part is really challenging. Within the sector as well, there is some important work needed. And I'm biased here because I'm about to, and I started teaching my leadership course that I teach in the summer. But are real discussion needed about the culture within organizations, decision making, evaluation, feedback, and learning. And there might be some generational differences sometimes between people in positions of leadership that are used in a particular way of things being done a particular way and a certain pace versus leaders in transition who want to have access to that, who are pushing, who are more disruptive. And I think we have to go back to a place where we're willing to take risk, that risk are not overly penalized by this, obsession of seeking efficiencies, everything. You need to propose something that's going to work 100% of the time, because if it doesn't, you're not going to get your funding renewed. But that's impossible. That's just not achievable. So I think that there's this disconnect between those who are really in leadership position that have, I've made it, yeah, and okay, what it takes, the conditions are so different from when they access that this recognition and this cultural shift within the sector needs to happen as well. So maybe flatten a bit our organization would be my leadership recommendation. But again, that I'm
Mm.
curious what other people think the recommendation should be.
A question from one of our participants, and it may be difficult to answer because we only have data from less than 2 years from the CICP. But is there any evidence that working conditions in the sector are improving or alternatively getting worse in terms of benefits or access to pension plans?
So far, our evidence, it really establishes the baseline, and that's why our project was so needed. Because at some point you're like, okay, we need the baseline, and what we're doing is we're asking different cohorts the same question so we can have some trend data. But what I can tell you is that our charities, organizations know that there's a real problem in terms of compensation. I think one of the positive is, and we'll see how that plays out, because one of the benefits of COVID and one of the strong suit of the sector, and we'll see if they lean into that, and I would suggest that they do, but is that the COVID required so much adaptation in such a little time, and people moving all their activities online, it's stopping costs, traveling, and there were a lot of new things and learning new ways to do their activities that were learned. And now we're kind of seeing, are they following or mimicking what's happening in more the private sector or other sectors where this urge to be back in person in the office? And there are some advantages to that. But one of the things the sector could lean into and continue supporting is this flexibility that becomes really appealing to young professionals who don't make the same economic decisions that other generations did. There is a real value, and I'll talk like an economist here, but the opportunity cost between your leisure time and your working time. And I think that the calculus now is a bit different for younger generation, where they're like, you know what, I value my time off. And so if you're offering me 4-day week, I'll take it, even if it's a reduced. So there are some opportunities like flexible work. I can work from home, recognizing that people have families, family event, caregiving activities. I think the sector would have an opportunity to present benefits that are not always tangible in dollars, but are worth a lot to the workforce. And that could be interesting. But I don't have data if there are the questions are there. People are raising that, but I cannot tell you for sure.
CICP asked a lot of questions about mental health, which has become a much greater concern coming out of COVID. What are you finding about some of the mental health issues?
But so the main one of the main thing, and it contributes to this trilemma. So it's really worth looking through the briefing note, because what we try to do in that briefing note is to refer also to some of the underlying studies. And if you go on our website and you go under governance and management or the various themes, you can see the titles of all the surveys. One of the surveys we asked, I think in year one, and we're asking again, relates to burnout, mental health. And what we're seeing, the good news is that there's increasing recognition within the organization that that's an issue, which I guess it's a good thing. And there's some investment in trying to find resources or provide resources to support that. But again, and we go back like a broken record to the trilemma, it's linked to the capacity of delivering these support, linked to the people and the retention, is that we're seeing a real exit. And I think in terms of what charity needs, in terms of support, beyond what's core funding, but support, even if it was a form of governmental support for benefits to provide the benefits or access to the benefits, that would be a key in the sector, because the retention problems also are linked to this burnout. Why would I do this, continue to do this, if there's no end in sight? And that's why I think this warning that we're giving today, not to paint everything gloom and doom, but more to say that we're nearing the end of resiliency here. And this is not a new situation, but it's a really critical situation. Governments need to be hearing this. Donors, individual Canadians need to support their charities. And, it's an ecosystem. It's not just the responsibility of one organization, the mental health crisis, and recognizing this and having forums and support for them.
Is there any hint from the data as to how the sector can craft such a message about not just what the problem is, but what some of the answers might be?
Yeah, we asked some questions, and as you know, Susan, because we're working on advocacy and the capacity in the sector, and one of the big challenges that the organizations are finding, and what we find in our data, is that sometimes they don't know where to ask for support, um, who to ask to advocate. There's a big part of the organizations that don't see this as core to their mission, even though they need it. And then who can they ask to advocate on their behalf? And the politics of advocating, like we all know how much politics there are also within the sector, but let's make abstraction of this. It's knowing where to turn, the fragmentation of information across the country, across departments within government is huge. Even myself, I work with data. There are people I talk to in Statistics Canada, experts, great, who don't know other people working on the charitable sector within Statistic Canada, because it's big. So there has to be some kind of coordination, some kind of aggregation here. And I think it's the same thing for coming to a common maybe not, consensus, because I think it's impossible, but a common core position of what we need. We have a lot of data here, solid data. And so, my plea, I guess, is use this to really show, like, across the board, it's core funding that is needed. Across the board, this is the kind of solution. And then if there's enough coherence in the message, I think. And then, there are great advocates out there that also need support. So I think it's just trickling. I don't have a clean solution for that problem, unfortunately.
It was interesting in the March survey where you asked about coalitions. What about
Yeah.
30, 40% said they participated in a coalition, although there was great misconception or fuzziness about what a coalition is. But I thought the interesting thing was almost all of those are with very like-minded charities, which have value, but building out more diverse, perhaps more um, uh, advocacy, policy engaged activities, where it's harder to do that when you're working in the same locale at the in the same subsector as opposed to
Yeah.
branching out.
And I think that's one of the neat thing about this research, this project in general, is that if you go to our website, there are some dashboards where people can actually play with some of the data and add filters. So people can, and that's one comment of feedback that we get consistently with our participant, is that it is so neat to hear from other charities. I thought I was alone in this, and I see that, I'm part of the big chunk that is facing the same thing. Or, oh wow, we're doing better here than I thought we were, because these are the other challenges. So I think there's this part of solidarity building almost within the sector that my hope is that the project contributes. But what you're saying is also came back at our last data summit that we held in November, and everyone, our next data summit will be held in October at Carleton. So please, we'll have information. Make sure that you keep up to date with our data. It's October 7th, if I'm not mistaken. But Jean-Marc Fontan from Quebec, from UQAM, was saying, maybe it's time for the sector as a whole to be less in silos and more really advocate and understand that it is permissible. The CRA rules have changed. And that maybe we can find ways to create this pan-Canadian solidarity around these issues.
Well, that's certainly echoed by one of the participants who said that the study underlines the need for coordinated sectoral advocacy for investments that address the trilemma. Any ideas on how we can collaborate, how we can use the CICP data for making a case to governments, to foundations, to the general public, donors?
Yeah, so I think, that I always have opinions and suggestions about everything. So yes, of course, I have a list of 105 points. No, jokes aside, I think the first thing is refer to the data, cite it. We're trying our best, and we're improving, and we're gonna develop a better search engine on our website to be able to sort through and create some kind of custom GPT for our data so people, users can access it. But refer to it, cite it, not so much because, it's kind of nice that when people refer to your work, but it's more that it is collected, up to date, systematically done. And the more we make the case on reliable data, the more the case will be heard. Because it is what it is. I'm not claiming that we're finding revolutionary new things here. I'm just saying we are providing the evidence that people are saying, oh, yeah, but this is an example of what's happening to you. But how do I know it's the case for everyone? The CICP is telling you this is a sector wide thing. So one. The second is, engage in events and give us feedback also, like things that you would like us to ask. And some of our best surveys are really people sending us email. Have you thought about asking this or engaging? And we're really keen because at the end of the day, and I think that's part of, I like to think the success, maybe people will disagree, but is that as a researcher, there's so many things I would like to ask, but I have to stop myself and also ask myself, what do people want to answer? It's not just about me, because this is not my data, this is our data collectively. And my job is to give it back. Perfect is the enemy of done. And here we're trying to walk the line of collecting it, giving it back. And in the background, obviously, we're working more and analyzing, producing all the things, but we too have limited capacity. So we're focusing on our mission is to provide up-to-date data, information on data literacy, and support organizations to make the case. And you have to tell us what's helpful and how it is, and we're going to work towards that.
Someone asked if you can remind us of the website
Oh,
address
yes.
again.
So the website is carleton.ca/CICP dash, no, the hyphen PCPOB. And PCPOB is in French. One of the things I'm presenting today in English, but you might have inferred I'm francophone from Montreal. So our study, our questions it's all bilingual. And so you have also information in French. And so we try our best. And so, yeah, so if you go there, you navigate, you'll find the research, all the data is there every week. We publish our results. You can subscribe to the newsletter and you'll get the newsletter with the highlights every Tuesday. We have videos and we're in the midst of producing these small reels about what is, data, what is, GPT, what is data cleaning, and how to save files in your computer, what are the best practices, etc. So we're producing that. So please keep in touch.
The trilemma may have longstanding roots, be more acute now, more dire, but it probably isn't an entire surprise. What findings, what things about this that you uncovered in the CICP surprised you the most? Were there things that you thought we didn't anticipate that question would have these kind of responses?
What surprised me the most? It's a good question. I think every week sometimes we're surprised because we ask questions and people's comment. So from a practical point of view, we were extremely surprised. It's not the questions per se, but when we ended year one, so first we have on average about 80% participation every week. So that's why I am comfortable saying our data is reliable, consistent.
Which is an enormous surprise in itself.
Yeah.
You got 20%, you would have done well.
Yes, exactly. According to all the research and what we were prepared. So I was shocked. And so we tried to figure out why. The most shocking thing was not that, which is quite surprising, was that people after the first year were starting to recruit the second year. And, we have a very extensive process. We spent a lot of resources engaging with people, contacting them, explaining what the project is, the benefits, because, we cannot offer compensation. You can imagine we're recruiting about 1,000 participant, and it's challenging because we got some feedback and saying we should provide compensation to individual participant, but between giving 1,000 people 20, 50 or $100, like it becomes so prohibitive and to monitor that but what was surprising is that people asked to remain in the study for a second year and a third year. So we have about now we checked, I checked the numbers, it was about 60, 70 people that have answered 3 years in a row, every week questions, which is interesting because we'll get this cohort data. In terms of questions, I think we were really keen at first asking questions about collaboration. The feedback we got was like, we don't want to answer questions about collaboration. And so it's more feedback on oh, you should be asking about this and surprising results. But sometimes we're just unsure what these results mean. And so we value a lot the engagements we have with our advisory committee. So people from across the country, across types of organizations are saying, so for example, the postal strike in December, we had a advisory committee, and people on the advisory committee were like, we're really curious of what the impact was on funding, on fundraising of the postal strike. And so I think that's more the willingness of people to share their time uh, consistently over a year. That's really the biggest surprise for me from a human perspective. I'm like, wow. And because we ask a lot, if you think about it, then I, completely appreciate people who say, sorry, I can't. But once you do it, I think a lot of people get almost, I like to think, not enjoyment, but, they're really curious. They want to know, okay, what's the answer? And I think we've hit a model that's would be sustainable.
CICP is radical, both from the perspective of going out every week to answer a couple questions, but that all of the data are open. They're there. We want people to use them, right? So it's an open invitation to dig in. It's not proprietary in the way that so much data is.
And it's really, and I hope people really feel this. It's really in the spirit of collaboration, not competition. Like what we do is provide really up to date, week to week questions of the moment. And we this it's not what we do to provide this really deep on this one questions. Hopefully, we find time as researchers to do more digging around these questions, but we're really here to support and complement some of the amazing work that's being done right now by, there are so many to our other organizations that produce amazing reports. And I was talking recently with other organizations that are saying, hey, is there a way we can collaborate? Because you have the capacity to pull what you're doing. And I'm like, yes, please. Like, we'll try to help you run questions you're interested in or slice the data in a way that's helpful specifically to you. And we're still working how this will work because this is a 5-year project and we're really now in the sustainability phase of our project to understand what's happening after 5 years. It would be too bad, I'm a researcher. My incentive here, and luckily, thank you, Carleton, I have tenure. So my incentive here is really to be almost convening this information and saying, okay, what do you need? And how can I leverage my expertise and the resources of the university? And what I've found, I don't know for you, Susan, because you've been in the sector longer as an academic as well, but uh, you know, sometimes I find, even though I complain, so I'm the first one to complain, oh, I'm so busy, but we as academics, as institutions, sometimes are underutilized. And I think there's a nice space where we
Right.
can, give support with our expertise, not replace anyone. So
Absolutely. And we're almost out of time, but I want to reinforce that I think this is a critical moment in time for the sector. We've just come through a major election, somewhat perhaps results that weren't anticipated a few years ago. Struck me that the charitable sector was nowhere in any platform, any discussion. It was invisible. And that's not new, but one would think it would be. And yet the implications of Canada Strong, of working with compassion and generosity is a moment for the sector to come together to demonstrate how it is uniquely placed to build community, inclusive, vibrant communities that make, as a whole, our country stronger. Any final words on that or anything else as we close off?
Susan knows me, I have many words on that. I'll confess, I also have a background in political science and international relations. So Canada's role and standing in the world has always been something really important. I see this moment as an opportunity to define how we do things here and lean into an identity that we reinforce through our commitments, whether it's through public policy, the meaning, the importance of the sector to support capacity, social change, and whatever consensus emerge about what this change is. It doesn't have to go my way or what I think should happen, but if we don't lean into that capacity, we're really at the moment where how do we define our sector will really impact the future and the way in which we will do things. For so long, we paralleled how the US, with some heritage coming from our historical roots, developed in Europe, in England, the UK. But we're at this moment where do we continue paralleling or do we actually develop a really true Canadian rooted model? And I have strong opinions. I think it's about time that we do that, but I'll leave it open for people to disagree with me.
Well, that's exactly why through the MPNL, we're working so hard to build out research, to mobilize research that is distinctively Canadian about philanthropy, and to build a center for philanthropy and civil society. Paloma, thank you. Thank you for your time today, for your leadership on the CICP. It is an exciting project, a delight to have us to be a little piece of it. But you've really brought a radical vision of how to do research in a reciprocal, in a spirit of reciprocity, as opposed to a more extractive view that we often take to research. So thank you, and I hope this was useful.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity, but really the biggest thank you is to my team. Honestly, like there is no way we could pull, and we're a very small team. So I think, everything you see from the infographics that you've seen are all in-house people working all the time, but also our participant. If it wasn't for the people that are already working so hard week after week, and I get really touched by their investment in for everyone else, not for them. It's really for everyone. And so this, I think we should, finish on this note. Thank you for all the participants and the people. And that's why I'm like, please amplify their work.
Well, again, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Our next PhilanthroThink is May 21st. It'll be at noon this time because one of our guests is in the UK and we're trying not to run into her evening. And that is focusing on innovation and invention, how to make pathways to making the sector more impactful. Thanks and bye now.